Hi everyone. This chapter looks at the political reality of international trade. Although many nations are nominally committed to free trade, they tend to intervene in international trade to protect the interests of politically important groups or promote the interests of key domestic producers. The review of the classical trade theories of Smith, Ricardo, and Hector Olin in previous chapter showed that in a world without trade barriers, trade patterns are determined by the relative productivity of different factors of production or inputs in different countries. So countries will specialize in products that they can make most efficiently while importing products that they can produce less efficiently. Remember that free trade refers to a situation in which a government does not attempt to restrict what its citizens can buy from or selling to another country. How do governments intervene in markets? Governments use various methods to intervene in markets, include one, which is tariffs, but we have two types, specific tariffs and ad valorem tariffs. The second one is through subsidies, three, import quotas. So we're going to discuss what is tariff rate quotas and quota rent. Four, we have voluntary export restraints. Five, local content requirements. Six, administrative trade policies. And the last, we have anti-dumping policies, aka countervailing duties. When we say tariff, it is a tax levied on imports or exports. Tariffs fall into two categories. We have specific tariffs, which are levied as fixed charge for each unit for a good imported. Let's say, for example, that uh, 150 pesos per barrel of oil. And another one, we have ad valorem tariffs, which are levied as a proportion of the value of the imported good. In most cases, tariffs are placed on imports to protect domestic producers from foreign competition by raising the price of imported good. However, tariffs also produce revenue for the government until the income tax was introduced. For example, in the Philippines, government received most of its revenues from tariffs. The important thing to understand about an import tariff is who suffers and who gains. So most likely the government gains because the tariff increases the government revenues. Domestic producers also gain because the tariffs afford them some protection against foreign competitors by increasing the cost of imported foreign goods. But consumer loss because they must pay more certain imports. In general, there are possible conclusions that we can derive from economic analysis of the effect of import tariffs. First is that tariffs are generally pro-producer and anti-consumer, while they protect producers from foreign competitors. This restriction of supply also raised domestic prices. Second one is that import tariffs reduce the overall efficiency of the world economy. They reduce efficiency because a protective tariff encourages domestic firms to produce products at home that could be produced more efficiently abroad. So the consequences here is that there is an efficient utilization of the resources. Sometimes tariffs are levied on exports of a product from a country. Let's say export tariffs are far less common than import tariffs. In general, export tariffs have two. First is to raise revenue for the government, and second one is to reduce exports from a sector, often for political reasons. For example, in China, China imposed a tariff on textile exports. The primary objective here was to moderate the growth in exports of textiles from China by elevating tensions with other trading partners. The next one is subsidy. So it is a government payment to a domestic producer. Subsidies take many forms, including cash grants, low interest loans, tax breaks, and government equity participation in domestic firms. By lowering the production cost, subsidies help domestic producers in two different ways. One is to competing against foreign imports and gaining export markets. While the purpose of the subsidy was to help survive a very difficult economic climate, one of the consequences was to give subsidized companies an unfair competitive advantage in the world industry. Agriculture tends to be one of the largest beneficiaries of subsidies in most countries, but it could be non-agricultural subsidies, which are much lower, but they are still significant. Then we have import quota, which is a direct restriction on the quantity of some good that may be imported into a country. The restriction is usually enforced by issuing import licenses to a group of individuals or firms. So, for example, the Philippines has a quota on rice imports. The only firms allowed to import rice are those certain trading companies. So each of which is allocated the right to import a maximum number of tons of rice each year. A common hybrid of a quota and a tariff is known as a tariff rate quota. Under a tariff rate quota, a lower tariff rate is applied to imports within the quota than those over the quota. For example, an ad valorem tariff rate of 10% might be levied on 1 million tons of rice imports into Philippines, after which an out of quota rate of 80% might be applied. So in Philippines might import 2 million tons of rice, wherein 1 million at a 10% tariff rate and another 1 million at an 80% tariff. So tariff rate quotas are common in agriculture where their goal is to limit imports over quota. Next, we have another variant on the import quota, which is voluntary export restraints or VER. This one is a quota on trade imposed by the exporting country, typically at the request of the importing country's government. Both import quotas and VER benefit domestic producers by limiting import competition. As with all restrictions on trade, quotas do not benefit consumers. An import quota or VER always raise the domestic price of an imported good. Then we have local content requirements is a requirement that some specific fraction of a good be produced domestically. The requirement can be expressed either in physical terms, let's say, for example, 75% of component parts for this product must be produced locally, or in value terms, let's say 74% of the value of this product must be produced locally. In addition to the formal instruments of trade policy, governments of all types sometimes use informal or administrative policies to restrict imports and boost exports. Let's say administrative trade policies. So these are bureaucratic rules designed to make it difficult for imports to enter a country. It has been argued that the Japanese are the masters of this trade barrier. In recent decades, Japan's formal tariff and non-tariff barriers have been among the lowest in the world. Next is we have an anti-dumping policy or anti-dumping policies, aka countervailing duties. So these are designed to punish foreign firms that engage in dumping. So the ultimate goal or objective here is to protect domestic producers from the unfair foreign competition. By the way, dumping is defined as selling goods in a foreign market at below their cost of production or as selling goods in a foreign market at below their fair market value. Let's say in the case of wheat flour, the Turkish flour dominated the domestic market position for flour here in the Philippines due to their prevailing low prices, despite the fact that the Philippines imposed anti-dumping duties. The Philippine Association of Flour Millers filed a petition against Turkish suppliers for flour. The imposition of anti-dumping was previously made in 2015 and was to expire actually this year of January. But it was extended by the Tariff Commission for another 3 years to complete the investigation. So this anti-dumping policy in the Philippines is to protect local producers from unfair foreign competition. So why do governments intervene in the market? Arguments for government intervention could take two paths. It could be political and economic. Political arguments for intervention are concerned with protecting the interests of certain groups within a nation, normally producers, often at the expense of the other groups, or normally these are the consumers, or with achieving some political objective that lies outside the sphere of economic relationships, such as protecting the environment or human rights. While economic arguments for intervention are typically concerned with boosting the overall wealth of a nation to the benefit of all, both producers and the consumers. So here, what are the possible political arguments or another political arguments for government intervention? Number one, the most common political argument for government intervention here is that it is necessary for protecting jobs or even industries for unfair foreign competition. Next is to protect industries deemed important for national security. So countries sometimes argue that it is necessary to protect certain industries because they are really important for national security. Let's say defense related industries often get this kind of attention like aerospace, advanced electronics, semiconductors, and etc. Then we have retaliation for unfair foreign competition. So some argue that government should use the threat to intervene in the trade policy as a bargaining tool to help open foreign markets and force trading partners, which is to play by the rules of the game. Let's say, for example, The US government has used the threat of punitive trade sanctions to try to get the Chinese government to enforce its intellectual property laws. Tax enforcement of these laws had give rise to massive copyright infringements in China that had been costly US companies like Microsoft hundreds of millions of dollars per year in loss of their sales revenues. After the US threatened to impose 100% tariffs on a range of Chinese imports, and after harsh words between officials from the two countries, the Chinese agreed to tighter enforcement of intellectual property regulations. Next is protecting consumers from dangerous products or unsafe products. So many governments have long had regulate this to protect consumers. The indirect effect of these regulations often to limit or ban the importation of such products. Let's say the Philippines has banned pork and non-pork based products from countries like Vietnam, China, and other European countries like Germany, Belgium, and others because the first case of the African swine fever was happened in the Philippines. Another one is that governments sometimes use trade policy to support their foreign policy objectives. A government may grant preferential trade terms to a country with which it wants to build strong relationships. Trade policy has also been used several times to pressure or punish those nations that do not abide by international law or norms. Another is protecting and promoting human rights in other countries, which is an important element of foreign policy for many democracies. Governments sometimes use trade policy to try to improve the human rights policies of trading partners. So for years, the most obvious example of this was the annual debate between United States over whether to grant most favored nation status to China. Most favored nation status allows countries to export goods to US under favorable terms. So under the most favored nation, the average tariff on Chinese goods imported into the US was 8%. So if China's most favored nation status were rescinded, tariffs could have risen to about 40%. Trading partners who are signatories of the WTO, as most are automatically receive most favored nation status. However, China did not join the WTO until 2001. Next is protecting the environment has become an important policy objective of many nations. One argument frequently made by the environmental organization that there is a strong relationship between income levels and environmental pollution and degradation. Let's say there is an industrial development that leads to more pollution. Thus, to the extent that in international trade, this will lead to a higher income levels. So it can also be expected to lead to a decline in the environmental quality. What are the economic arguments for government intervention? With the development of the new trade theory and strategic trade policy, the economic arguments for government intervention have undergone an renaissance in recent years. Until the early 1980s, most economists saw little benefit in the government intervention and strongly advocate a free trade policy. We have one, let's say, the infant industry argument, this is by far the most or the oldest economic argument for government intervention. And Alexander Hamilton proposed this in 1792. According to this argument, many developing countries have a potential comparative advantage in manufacturing, but new manufacturing industries cannot initially compete with established industries in developed countries. To allow manufacturing to get a twofold, the argument here is that government should temporarily support new industries by imposing tariffs, imposing import quotas and subsidies until they have grown strong enough to meet international competition. The strat the strategic trade policy argument has also two components. First, it is argued that by appropriate actions, a government can help raise national income if it can somehow ensure that the firm or firms that gain first mover advantages in an industry are domestic rather than foreign enterprises. Thus, according to the strategic trade policy argument, a government should use subsidies to support promising firms that are active in newly emerging industries. The second component of the strategic trade policy argument is that it might pay a government to intervene in an industry by helping domestic firms overcome the barriers to entry created by foreign firms that have already reaped first mover advantages. When should governments avoid using trade barriers? Paul Krugman argues that strategic trade policies aim at establishing domestic firms in a dominant position in a global industry are beggar thigh labor policies that boost national income at the expense of other countries. So countries that attempt to use such policies will probably provoke retaliation. Krugman argues that since special interest groups can influence governments, strategic trade policy is almost certain to be captured by the such groups who will distort it to their own ends. How has the current world trading system emerged? This was until the Great Depression in US um, in the 1930s. Most countries had some degree of protectionism. After the World War II, the US and other nations realized the value of freer trade. Thus, the GATT or the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade was began, which this one is a multilateral agreement to liberalize trade. In the 1980s and early 1990s, protectionist trends emerged. The Uruguay round of GATT in negotiations began in 1986, focusing on one, services and intellectual property, then the World Trade Organization. So the WTO encompasses GATT along with the two sisters organization. So we have the General Agreement on Trade in Services, working to extend free trade agreements to services, and the other one is the Agreement on Trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights. This is working to develop common international rights for intellectual property rights. The WTO has emerged as an effective advocate and facilitator of future trade deals, particularly in such areas as services. Currently, in 2017, the WTO has now 164 member nations. So far, the WTO's policing and enforcement mechanisms are having a positive effect. Most countries have adopted WTO recommendations for trade disputes and a magnet for various groups, protesting free trade. The current agenda of the WTO focuses on one, the rise of anti dumping policies, two, the high level of protectionism in agriculture, three, the lack of strong protection for intellectual property rights in many nations, and fourth, the continued high tariffs on non agricultural goods and services in many nations. The WTO launched a new round of talks at Doha, Qatar in 2001 that were still going on in 2011. The agenda here includes one, cutting tariffs on industrial goods and services. Next, phasing out subsidies to agriculture producers, followed by reducing barriers to cross border investment, and the last, limiting the use of anti dumping laws. What do trade barriers mean for managers? Managers need to consider how trade barriers affect the strategy of the firm and the implications of government policy on the firm. One, trade barriers raise the cost of exporting products to a country. Number two, voluntary export restraints may limit a firm's ability to serve a country from locations outside that country. Three, to conform to local content requirements, a firm may have to locate more production activities in a given market than it could or it would otherwise. Managers have an incentive to lobby for free trade and keep protectionist pressures from causing them to have to change strategies.